Ni howdy, y'all. Welcome to the last and final episode of Season 2 of Gong Fu Tea Cha. And I'm here today. My name's Sohan. I'm here at West China Tea House. And I'm very excited to take this topic of tea and ask a question that we actually haven't answered yet here at the end of Season 2 after many years of making the show, which is, what is tea? We've never actually just faced this question head on. And the short answer is tea is this plant, Camellia sinensis, and breeds of it and hybrids of it and close relatives of it. That's the short answer, and I think most people watching this show know that when we talk about tea, we're talking about this one particular plant. Just like tobacco is the name of a plant, tea is the name of a plant. And therefore, what are teas? Well, green tea is tea, black tea is tea, etc., etc. Some of the teas that we've talked about, well, all of the teas that we talked about throughout the course of this second season have been teas from this one plant. So that kind of begs the question, well, if tea is just this one plant, what's the deal? Why is green tea green tea? Why is black tea black tea? How many different kinds of tea are there? And we're going to attempt and endeavor to answer these questions, especially in the context of Chinese tea, which is the subject of this series. And we're going to go ahead and start with green tea and the oxidation spectrum. But first, I want to introduce my stuff for this final episode. I'm making a tea that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I could just have made any tea at all. And so tonight I chose to make this Shoya Bao. This is a bud tea, a Danya pure bud tea from the Camellia crassicolumna plants of Yunnan, which is where Pu'er comes from. These plants are related to the Pu'er plants, but they are actually a different species. And they don't have caffeine, so studies have found, and I'm going to enjoy some today because I really like this tea, and also it's really late at night already. I also want to show off my teaware today for this last episode. I'm getting my fancy stuff out. I just got this beautiful gaiwan by a woman named Yuan Yuan in Jingdezhen, and I paired it with this really cool Gongda Bay that we call the Ice Penguin Gongda Bay. Then I have my black sand clay cup here from Yingjing. These are all like besides this, these are all like personal collection objects here that I don't get to show off very much. So this one has blue. There's only 2 pieces in the whole kiln that came out blue, and this is one of them, and I have the other one too. And then I've got my little cute chanchu here, and yeah, I'm gonna make some shoya about, talk about the types of tea. So when we are categorizing tea, I want to bring in the caveat that the categories of tea and the distinctions around the different types of tea come to us from an academic perspective, fundamentally. The 6 types of tea were defined in the 20th century as part of the Chinese academic endeavor to create an institutional standards around tea, and to categorize all these different types of tea that exist in China under these parent groups so that it was clear and they could be easily distinguished from each other. And so I want y'all to think of it this way. They say about like language, linguistics, grammar, things like that, those are descriptive, not prescriptive. So for example, here in Texas, we say y'all, and there are people like, y'all's not a word. Well, it absolutely is a word because people say it, and it means something, and the meaning is understood when other people hear it. Therefore, it's a word, and it is used. It is part of the language. It doesn't really matter what someone who is writing the rules of grammar for school children say about the word y'all, because it is used, and therefore it is part of the language. And linguistics and other disciplines like that, at their best, strive to describe what is happening, something that is naturally and organically emerging, rather than try to prescribe the way that things should be done. So I want us to think about tea that way. There are these categories that have been put on tea. They took all these different teas and they endeavored to categorize them and give some kind of structure to them. And that helps us to understand them better, but that doesn't mean that teas have to neatly fit into these groups. And it doesn't mean that there are hard and fast rules that really govern what something is, for example, a green tea or an oolong tea or red tea. And that while there might be numbers out there associated with those things, people will make tea and they will say that this is this kind of tea, and I'm not going to argue with them about it. Someone makes a tea and they say this is green tea, I'm not going to be like, this is 12% oxidized, which is too much oxidation for green tea. Well, anyways, that's my big caveat asterisk right at the beginning of this episode, and I'm going to go ahead and start making my tea, and I'm going to talk about green tea. Why do I start with green tea? Green tea is a great place to start because it is the essential character of tea being expressed. If you were to go and get out on all fours and munch a tea leaf off of a living tea plant, it would taste like green tea, not like red tea, not like white tea. A fresh green leaf would taste like green tea. So that's the taste of the plant when it's alive, sort of. I mean, it'd be very different, but it would taste the most like green tea. And so that's a great place to start because that's tea in its essential state. And it's also something that's familiar to everybody. A great place to start when, besides to educate people with this episode, my goal is also to, when someone asks you about tea, you tea lover out there watching YouTube, when your friend who doesn't know anything about tea asks you about tea, here's a great way to explain it to them that will hopefully make sense to you and therefore to them as well. You got green tea, you've got black tea. These are two teas that almost everyone is familiar with. Most people have tried these. So it's a great place to start. I always say, okay, I'm going to start saying red tea. When I say, instead of saying black tea, I'm going to say red tea because in what is known in the West as black tea is called red tea in Chinese. And so that's the word I'm going to use. Establish that right at the beginning. We talked about that in our red tea episode. It doesn't matter. It's not important, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to do it that way to avoid confusion later on. Green tea is unoxidized tea. Red tea is fully oxidized tea. So we're setting the poles of an oxidation spectrum right now. And on one hand, you have the essential fresh taste of tea, which is green tea. And when we think of green tea, people think of matcha, jasmine tea, things like that. That's green tea. And any of the teas that we talked about in our green tea episode, and many, many more. And then on the other end of that spectrum, the other pole of that spectrum, you have red tea, fully oxidized tea. And I always say Lipton chai, Earl Grey. English breakfast, Irish breakfast. There's a ton of different teas that people are very familiar with. Nest tea, brisk iced tea, sweet tea. These are all going to be in that family of teas that are known in the West as black teas, but that we're going to call red teas. And they're on the other end of this oxidation spectrum. So green tea, unoxidized, red tea, fully oxidized. When I say oxidation, what do I mean? Did I put my tea in here? I did, great. You bite into an apple and the white flesh turns brown. That is oxidation. That is a very familiar example of oxidation. You can also think on green avocado turning black, that's oxidation. You can also think you crush some garlic and it gets more fragrant. You massage some kale or bruise some basil and it gets dark and the flavor gets more potent. That's also oxidation. It's a chemical process and it happens to tea. If you take, let's go back to being that four-legged herbivore munching on the tea plant. You pick one of those fresh leaves and you just let it sit and it will wither and it will wilt and it will turn brown, reddish brown. Lots of things do this. And it's that same process, that same oxidation process that's happening is this the rinse? This is the rinse, yeah. It's the same oxidation process that is happening when, an apple turns brown. But in tea, it's changing a lot of the chemicals that are antioxidant in the tea. We always say green tea has lots of antioxidants. Well, that's true. And as it oxidizes, those things that are antioxidants turn into their oxidized byproducts. So those antioxidants oxidize, and then you have less antioxidants, but you have more other stuff, the stuff that those antioxidants turn into as they oxidize. And so green tea has lots of antioxidants. Those oxidize on their journey to becoming red tea. And then at the end, you have a tea that is chemically different. They're chemically very the opposite of each other as far as oxidation goes. And what does that oxidation process do? It changes the color, obviously. First of all, it gets darker. It changes the flavor. You go from having that grassy green tea taste to that more earthy red tea taste. And then you get health changes. There's just chemical changes on every level there. And then if you look at that same oxidation spectrum, we can use that to place other types of tea. Not all of them, but some of them. We can place the other types of tea with them. So you've got green tea and red tea as your poles. And then in between, you've got oolong. And this is a very glib description of what oolong tea is. And for a less glib and more nuanced description, you can watch the 4 different episodes that we made just about oolong tea, and that will give you a much deeper dive into the oolong and what it really is. But the short answer for your friend who you do not want to frighten and overwhelm with your interest in tea, you can say green tea is unoxidized, red tea is fully oxidized, oolong tea is partially oxidized in the middle of this spectrum. And that means that it could be very low oxidation, close to green tea. It could be high oxidation, close to red tea. There's a whole range in there, which is one of the reasons why oolong is the most diverse single category of tea. Hold on, I'm gonna drink some tea. Oh, wow, I really needed that tea. Talking at a camera is a weird thing to do. I feel like I've gotten comfortable enough doing it over the years of doing it, but it never stops being fundamentally a weird thing to do. And it's nice to actually drink some tea while you're trying to talk to a camera about tea. So, oxidation. Green tea, unoxidized. Red tea, fully oxidized. Oolong tea, partially oxidized. And then there's yellow tea. What's the deal with that? Yellow tea is a little more oxidized than green tea. This kind of begs the question, what are the exact percentages? Well, there doesn't seem to be a final authoritative consensus on this. And if I'm wrong about this, then please cite in the comments and please let me know and I will revise my general statement on this. But it doesn't seem like there is a hard and fast rule for what level of oxidation defines these different categories. They say green tea is unoxidized. Well, it probably gets a little oxidized. You know, I've been there when they make green tea. Some batches of green tea are getting picked and they're first in line and they just get tossed in the wok and they get fixed and maybe they're 0% oxidized, probably not exactly 0. And then there's another batch that gets done at the end of the morning. There's the last batch that gets thrown in the wok and it's been sitting there for, you know, extra however long. Could be an hour, could be more. So green tea is obviously sometimes more than 0% oxidized, but I don't think anyone really cares. It's not important. If you pick the tea and then you cook it right away as fast as you can, then and you dry it out, then you're gonna call it green tea. And then, like I said, I'm not gonna argue with it. There's a really amazing green tea by Master Lin in Guizhou, Master's Green, and you know, heck, if it doesn't taste like an oolong and smell like an oolong, and that's because he leaves it out on mats for like 40 days. He's got this totally unique process that he was taught for processing tea, and he lets it hang out for a really long time, which is not normally what you do with green tea, and then he cooks it and it's delicious and he calls it green tea, and I'm not going to tell him it's not. You can tell him if you want, but he's the tea master. He made it. So and what level of oxidation is that? Well, I don't know if it would fit into whatever the various distinctions that are made are. Mostly people just say it's unoxidized. Likewise, you know, they say red tea is fully oxidized. Some people say it's more than 80% oxidized can be called red tea. So, which is it? It's not really clear and it's not necessarily, to me, important. If someone makes a tea and it's within tolerances and they say it's this kind of tea, I'm just going to be like, yeah, it's this kind of tea. Oolong tea is a lot harder to, or a lot easier to distinguish because there's all of these other parameters that go along with it besides the oxidation level. But in a general sense, the oxidation levels that it will fall between are going to be between like 20 to 80%. Normally is where you'll see oolongs. And you get very highly oxidized oolongs like the Wui oolongs. You get low oxidation oolongs like Taiwanese Gaoshan oolongs and some of the Anxi oolongs. Then you get medium oxidized Phoenix oolongs that are all across the map that have all these different levels of oxidation and roasting. And in that you get all the different expression of the different breeds that are used to make oolong, and you get this very diverse category. And then when we look at yellow tea doesn't have all of that stuff, all of the roasting and the distinct breeds being bred, you know, for many generations to achieve this particular characteristic. Yellow tea is very similar to green tea in that it has this much more naturalistic feel to it. It doesn't undergo the heavy processing that oolong does. But it is more oxidized than green tea, and it goes through the menhuang process, the sealing the yellow process, where it's allowed to wither and oxidize, and then it's fixed into place and cooked. like green tea is. And so in all cases, when we're talking, this is the last of the oxidation spectrum that we're going to talk about. After this, we're going to leave the oxidation spectrum. So to kind of give an overhead view of what this oxidation process looks like in tea, tea has antioxidants when it's fresh and green. There's an enzyme called polyphenol oxidase, and that catalyzes the oxidation of these tea chemicals, these polyphenols in the tea. Okay, you with me? This enzyme is like a little protein machine. That's what enzymes are. They're like tiny little microscopic machines, and they're made out of proteins. And if you heat them to a certain temperature, it will denature the proteins and it will break them. They just won't work anymore. And so if you want to stop the oxidation of tea, if you want to control the oxidation of tea, it happens naturally, it happens on its own because of this enzyme and because of oxygen. It's a natural chemical process. But if you cook the tea and denature this enzyme, then you will slow the oxidation process way, way, way down. And so that's how we control the oxidation of tea. If we want green tea, we cook it right away. That's called Sha Qing, kill the green. And we cook, we pick it, and as fresh as we can, we cook it, kill that enzyme, denature that enzyme, and seal it in that oxidation state. If we want yellow tea, then we allow it to wither and oxidize first, then we cook it. If we want a low oxidation oolong tea, we wait a little longer, we do some more stuff to it, then we cook it. Same with high oxidation oolong tea. Cook it when it's oxidized to the degree that you want and stop that oxidation process, fix it in that oxidation state. And then red tea, you cook it, but you don't have to. There's sun-dried red. There are red teas that aren't cooked at all because you don't really need to because you're not trying to stop the oxidation process at any point. That brings us to out of the oxidation spectrum. That kind of puts a nice little safety pin on the oxidation spectrum and gets it all wrapped up. And it also segues us very nicely, thank you, Sohan, to the next category of tea, which is white tea. Why, you might ask, is that a good segue? Because white tea is by definition not cooked. That is, well, here's the thing. Apparently they dry it with charcoal sometimes, but it does not undergo this Sha Qing fixing process, this kill green process at all. It's not part of the process for making white tea. Whereas all those other types of tea that I mentioned, and some that I'm about to mention, undergo this Sha Qing process, this kill green fixing process. White tea must not. It is imperative that white tea do not, or it will not be white tea no mo. And so that's basically all white tea is. White tea is raw. It does not get cooked, and therefore it does not get fixed in a particular state of oxidation. Now, how is that not red tea? Well, red tea is oxidized, and that oxidation process is helped along by processes like massaging the tea to break open the cell walls and get that, just like bruising your garlic or bruising your basil and kind of squishing it up, really getting that good oxidation in there. They'll do that to red teas. They'll massage it, and that hastens the oxidation process. And also, baking, heating it can help to oxidize it, baking it. There are different ways of doing this. But white tea does not undergo those processes, nor does it get cooked. So there's no intentional effort to oxidize white tea, nor is there an intentional effort to prevent it from oxidizing. White tea is picked and then it is dried in the sun, usually in the sun. It can also be dried in the shade. It can also be dried in a cave. It can also be dried indoors. It could also be dried with fans, on a train, on a box. I was going to say in the rain, but you can't dry it in the rain. You don't make white tea when it's raining, so that's just part of the deal. And that's what it is to be a white tea master, is not to be doing a bunch of fancy technical stuff like an oolong master. It's to be really good at reading the weather and knowing when it's time to make white tea, if you're making it outside. The best white tea is dried in a natural setting, typically in the sun, sun-dried white tea. You don't want it to be too sunny of a day. There's all these parameters that white tea masters are looking for when they decide when to make white tea. It's very interesting. I've had them talk to me about them all, and there's a lot. They're looking at which way the wind's blowing from. They're looking at the clouds. They're looking at the humidity, and they have all these indices for deciding how to dry the tea and like where and when. And it's really very interesting. But so then where is white tea on the oxidation spectrum? Unlike the teas that we just talked about, white tea is dynamic in its oxidation level. The teas we just talked about have either been fully oxidized right off the bat, or they have been fixed in their oxidation state through this cooking process at some point. But white tea doesn't get fixed, and it is not coming off the factory floor fully oxidized like a red tea. So when white tea is fresh, it's unoxidized, like green tea. It's going to be chemically close to green tea. And then as it ages, because this enzyme, polyphenol oxidase, was not denatured and remains active, it continues to oxidize, but not very fast. Not as fast as the fresh tea leaves would. Like when you're making red tea and you massage them and you're withering them and you're oxidizing them, they're wet still. They haven't been dried out completely. Oxidation, it's just like iron rusts, it oxidizes when it gets water on it. You get water on iron and then you get rust there. Oxidation happens when there's a moist interface. And so it happens faster when there's a moist interface. So when you dry the leaves out in the sun, as you do with white tea, you are slowing down that oxidation process, but not as much as if you were to denature the enzyme and dry it out, as happens with all these other types of tea, right? And so you have a tea that is oxidizing slowly, but still more than and faster than something like green tea or oolong tea would be. So as the white tea ages, it goes from being unoxidized and therefore similar to green tea, and it traverses the oxidation spectrum and becomes more like red tea as it ages and as it oxidizes. How fast does it oxidize, you might ask? Well, they have a saying in Fuding about white tea, which is 1年茶, 3年药, 7年宝, which is 1 year tea, 3 years medicine, 7 years treasure. So here's how I interpret that. When it's 3 years old, it's halfway oxidized. When it's 7 years old, it's fully oxidized. Because in Fuding, they are like, I'm like, does that mean that it's peaks at 7 years? And they're like, yes, it's best at 7 years. I'm like, what about 8 years? Like, that's too old. I'm like, well, okay. I actually like white tea that gets older than that, but some people don't, because I think after it's done oxidizing all the way, it starts to ferment, starts to become like Hei Cha, which we'll get to next in just a second. But and they don't like that, but I do. Sohan likes that, and a lot of other people do. So I actually do like white tea past 7 years. But why is that magic number 7? Because I believe that is when this white tea, usually as a cake, is done oxidizing. That's when it's fully oxidized. Why is it 3 and 7 and not 3 and 6? Well, because as it oxidizes, there's less stuff to oxidize, and the process just slows down. The half-life of this is going to be different than the endpoint, than half the endpoint. That's my hypothesis. It's also a Bing. It's kind of thick, and so that oxidation process slows way down, and the interior of the Bing is going to oxidize last. And so white tea is not defined by its position on the oxidation spectrum. Rather, it is defined by not being subjected to any intentional oxidation or prevention of oxidation. And as it ages, going from fresh white tea to aged white tea, it traverses the oxidation spectrum and it goes from unoxidized to oxidized, and gives us that lovely progression from being like that fresh herbaceous quality of white tea to being that rich honey, date, dried fruit profile that we get from aged white tea. And if you want to learn more about that, you can watch our white tea episodes. There are 2 of them. We did fresh white tea and aged white tea. It was great. So what have we done? We've done green. We've done red. We've done oolong. We've done yellow. We've done white. Now we move on to the 6th category of tea. That's 5, right? Green, red, oolong, yellow, white. And then number 6 is Hei Cha. Hei Cha means black tea. This is why we made that distinction right at the beginning of calling fully oxidized tea red tea, because in Chinese there is a category of tea that directly translates to black tea, and that is Hei Cha. And we call it dark tea in English only because black tea was already taken wrongly by the category that we call red tea. So we translate it as dark tea, but really it's black tea. What does it mean? It means fermented tea. So I said that just a minute ago. I said white tea starts to oxidize, and then after it's done oxidizing, and if it sits around long enough, it will start to ferment. It will start to break down and decompose. And then it is turning into a category that we call Hei Cha. It is on its way to becoming a Hei Cha. Hei Cha is any and all fermented teas. And I know that some people out there are like, you mean like Pu'er? Yes, kind of like that. I'm going to get to that in a second. It will be addressed. Tea is a plant. It's a leaf, mostly. And what happens to leaves? They turn into dirt. And tea does too. Tea, like any other leaf, does this. And when we talk about tea having tobacco-y notes, that's a good hint as to why tea sometimes has tobacco-y notes, because tobacco, like tea, is leaves, and like tea, it breaks down. Cigar, for example, an aged cigar that is being aged in a humidor is decomposing, and that gives it its earthy, pungent character that is so prized by lovers of aged cigars. Likewise, there are many types of tea that are prized and treasured for the fact that they are essentially turning into dirt, and that nice earthy flavor that gives the teas is enjoyed by connoisseurs of those categories. So Hei Cha's fermented tea, that can be done intentionally through a process like the Wodoi process, where you are piling the leaves, wetting them down, and turning them like compost. Or there's other ways to ferment tea. There's many other ways. You can do it in a basket, but there are intentional ways of fermenting tea, and you can also just let it hang out until it does. It will eventually start to ferment. And when I say ferment, people get confused. They're like, fermenting, they think of wine or cheese or yogurt. Those are different kinds of fermentation. Those are, like lacto-fermentation, and they're happening in a wet state. They're happening in a moist medium. Tea, again, is more like composting. It is doing what a pile of leaves in the yard does. It is doing what a cigar does. It is fermenting in the sense that there is anaerobic respiration happening and breaking down of the plant matter, and you're getting those earthy, loamy qualities from that process. So now, I know you're like, what about Pu'er? Pu'er is not really a category of tea in an official sense. It's not a category on the same level that green tea or white tea are. Pu'er, you can think of Pu'er as being like, it's kind of like champagne. Champagne is a type of white wine, but we don't think of it that way. If you go to the wine store and you want to buy champagne, you go to the champagne section. You don't go to the white wine section, because everyone knows what champagne is, and there's a whole section dedicated to that. Or maybe it's in the sparkling wine section, but you know what I mean. Even though it is white wine, we don't think of it that way. Pu'er is a couple different types of tea. What it really is Pu'er is a regional designation. Pu'er is a designation for a particular type of tea from Yunnan that has been used as a trade commodity for many, many centuries, and therefore has acquired a following and a culture unto itself and a reputation unto itself that distinguishes it from the rest of the tea world. So it gets treated like a category, just like champagne, even though it's not exactly. So we just finished on Hei Cha, so I'm going to use that to segue into the type of Pu'er that's familiar to most drinkers of Pu'er in the West, which is Shu Pu'er or Shou Pu'er. Both of those words, by the way, are correct. People argue about which one. Well, I'll tell you this. In China, where people really speak Chinese and really drink tea, they will use both words. I have heard both pronunciations of that character used. Sometimes in Chinese, you can have one character pronounced in multiple ways. This is one of those characters. The character shu or shou means ripened. It also means cooked in different contexts. And I tend to use shu because that's what the farmers in Yunnan say. They say shu cha, shu pu'er. They don't say shou. But in Eastern China, when referring to pu'er, they do say shou. So people can argue about which one is right, but the fact of the matter is that both are acceptable, and making a big deal about one being more right than another is asinine and missing the point. You know what else is? Arguing about how to spell Pu'er. People are always like, how do we spell Pu'er? And I'm like, I don't know, P-U-E-R? And they're like, well, what about the H? I've seen it with an H on the internet. I'm like, well, sure, you want an H, put an H. Like, but I want to know the right way. I'm like, you want to know the right way to spell pu'er? With the Chinese characters. That's how you spell pu'er. You don't spell it, you write it in Chinese with Chinese characters. That's the right way. Short of that, there are many different romanizations. We use PU''ER, and that is literally an SEO thing. There's no other reason for that. I think using an H is using typeface and wasting it because you don't need the H. It contributes nothing phonetically. So there's no reason to argue about Shu versus Shou pu'er. There's no reason to argue about the way that pu'er is spelled. Let's talk about what pu'er is. What Shu pu'er is specifically. It is fermented pu'er. It is a Hei Cha. It is in this category of fermented teas that we just covered, and it is from Yunnan, and it is from the Daiyazhong big leaf tea plants, and it is traditionally pressed into cakes and bricks and traded along the Chama Gudao, the ancient tea horse road that goes from Yunnan up into Tibet to Lhasa, where these bricks and cakes of tea are used as currency and traded for livestock. So that's what pu'er is. It's this one particular type of tea. It comes from Yunnan. It was traded for livestock. There are all kinds of vicissitudes of the tea that go along with that. And it can be fermented. And when it is fermented, we call it Shu pu'er or Shou pu'er. And it is a type of Hei Cha, although we don't refer to it that way. So when you hear people talking about Hei Cha, they're usually using that word to refer to any fermented tea that is not pu'er, right? If they mean pu'er, they'll just say pu'er. And anything that is fermented but not pu'er, meaning it's not from Yunnan, and it's not from those big leaf tea plants, and it does not meet the burden of being called pu'er, is therefore referred to as Hei Cha. So that's how you hear it used. Shu pu'er, what is Shu pu'er? Why does it exist? Well, it's fermented pu'er, as we've already said. Why does it exist? Why did people decide to start fermenting this tea and making it into Hei Cha? Well, because before it was produced in its kind of green state. It was produced as essentially like a green tea that would be made from these big leaf tea plants cooked at a lower temperature, getting a little bit of massaging in there too. It gets a little bit of treatment that green teas don't usually get traditionally in some places, and then being sun dried. So it's cooked, it's fixed like green tea, it's sun dried, then it would be weighed, steamed, pressed into cakes, and then traded for horses on the tea horse road. And on its journey, which would take 6 months one way and 6 months the other way, it would be rained on, it would be dewed on, it would be sitting in a warehouse for God knows how long before it got shipped out, because these teas were produced and pressed and weighed and standardized and regulated by the Chinese imperial government. And they would put their stamp on that, and they'd say, this is a bing, this weighs 357 grams, this is a unit. When you trade a horse for it, you can just look at these bings and know how many that you've got, and know how much tea you've got. And there we go, there's already water in that guy. So people would have these cakes for a long time, is my point. They would be around for a long time. They wouldn't just get made and then immediately drunk, because people would trade horses for them, and then they wouldn't necessarily keep all that tea. They would be like, well, I just got 84 cakes of tea from a horse. How, you want some tea? I'll trade you some tea for some yak butter or some blankets or some whatever. Whatever stuff they were trading, they would then continue to use this tea that they had received as currency and trade it for people. And so you had this tea economy built up around that. And these cakes, by the time someone was actually drinking them, they would have gotten old and dark and earthy. Kind of like this tea that we're drinking right now. They would look like this and have that dark, dark color. And so that type of pu'er is what we now call Shangpua, which means raw. It also means alive. There's a couple different meanings for this word sheng. It is in fact cooked, because it's like green tea in the sense that it gets shaqing, it gets cooked. So, we can call it raw, but know that it is in fact cooked. All types of pu'er are cooked, and they do go through the cooking process. But when we're referring to it now, what does that mean? Sheng pu'er, it means pu'er that was processed like green tea, that was unoxidized and unfermented. When it was finished, when it was pressed into a cake and released to the public, it was an unoxidized and unfermented tea that will both oxidize and ferment, ultimately ferment. Along this long journey, it would oxidize completely and it would start to ferment just like a white tea does. Despite having been sha-chinged, it will oxidize anyways in the process of getting to that aged state. And so Shangpua can and will turn dark and earthy over time and be similar in that sense to Shu Pu'er that people are much more familiar with and that has that dark color and flavor. It'll never be exactly the same. It's never going to be quite as thick and as dark and as earthy as you usually get Shu Pu'er, unless it's wet stored in a wet environment. But over the course of its lifetime, it also starts on that low oxidation state and traverses that oxidation spectrum, although we don't talk about it, but it does do it. And then it hops over into that Hei Cha category. Eventually it will become Hei Cha. There's some contention around this where people are like, it has to be Wodoi to be Hei Cha, it has to come off the factory floor already fermented, it's not Hei Cha. Okay, that said, people do call these types of tea Hei Cha. There are plenty of types of tea that end up fermented and they are then called Hei Cha. So again, it's not worth arguing about. The fact of the matter is that it does ferment and therefore in its fermented state it can be considered Hei Cha, but it will never be considered Shu Cha. It will never be considered Shu Pu'er. No matter how dark and fermented it gets, you can call it Chen. Chen means aged and matured, and that's a term that we can apply to those old teas that have fermented and become dark with age, but they still have not been subjected to an intentional fermentation process, therefore they are not Shu Cha. That brings us to the end of Pu'er. So there we go. We've already delved through the 6 official categories of tea. We have looked at one of the not really a monocladistic category of tea or phylogenetic, not really a phylogenetic category of tea unto itself, but that is often used to talk about tea. You cannot go into the world of tea on the internet, for example, without hearing about Pu'er, Chinese tea. You will hear about Pu'er. What is it? Is it a type of tea? Not really. Now you know what it is. There are other types of tea that aren't really types of tea, but that get talked about. And we have done episodes on all of these. One of my favorite episodes that we did was purple tea. And in that episode, we learned, as we will learn again today, that purple tea, again, is not a category of tea the way that green tea or red tea or white tea are. And it's not a geographical, cultural, historical designation the way that Pu'er is either. What is purple tea? Purple tea is a reference to the color of the leaves of the living plant. Just like you've got green cabbage and purple cabbage, you've got green tea and purple tea. Most tea plants are green, sometimes they're purple. It's a mutation, it's rare. They also have bred purple breeds of tea because they like it. And if you want to know more about that, you can go check out our purple episode. I've got a really great analogy about Aretha Franklin and Christina Aguilera. It's definitely one of the high points of my tea show making career. So please go, and if you do see that episode, please enjoy that analogy. But when we talk about purple tea, we're just talking about the plant itself and its phenotype. This is a morph of the tea plant. It is purple, and you can make any kind of tea out of it. You can make green tea, you can make white tea, you can make red tea, you can make Shangpua, you can make Shu Pu'er. We have literally every one of those that I just mentioned. We have purple versions of all of those teas here at this tea house, which is pretty awesome actually, because we love purple tea over here. And you can make Hei Cha, which is again, purple Shu Pu'er is Hei Cha. So you can make all of the 6 official categories of tea, and you can make both kinds of Pu'er with it. Traditionally, when you look at purple tea, you were looking at Yunnan purple tea, so Pu'er. They also have purple tea in Kenya now. That's a big thing. But you're thinking, when we talk about purple tea, usually in the market, we're talking about purple Pu'er specifically, either the naturally occurring mutant purple plants, which is called Ziya Cha, the purple bud, and then there's also Zhejian Cha, which is the purple grace cultivar that has been bred for its purpleness. We talk about that again, Aretha Franklin, Christina Aguilera. You want to know which one is which? Go watch the episode. And those are kind of the two divisions of purple tea that you get within this grouping that is really dependent on the color of the leaves rather than the process the tea goes through. So again, you can have the naturally occurring ziya, where you can have the bred, cultivated zhejian, and each one of those can be made into any type of tea. And that's a purple tea for you. And that brings us to our last category of tea, which is the type of tea that I am drinking right now, which is unorthodox. And you can go watch our unorthodox episode that we did that one very recently. I think this is a very important category, even though there aren't that many teas that we have in our catalog that fit into this category. There's only a few. This is one of them. And this, again, is this really tea? This is from Camellia crassicolumna, a close relative of the tea plant. Well, that's why we stick it in the unorthodox category. It's tea enough for me. It's a different species, but it's close enough, and they call it wild tea in Yunnan, where it's from. What kind of tea is it? It's unorthodox. What kind of tea is panlong? It's not exactly an oolong because it's raw, but it's not exactly a white tea because it's this crazy one tea plant that grows curled around another plant, and it is from the Phoenix Mountains, and it's related to oolong plants, but it's definitely not oolong. So what is it? Well, it's unorthodox tea. Saving some space in your mind for teas that don't adhere to these particular standards. There's, for example, there's a tea that this one dude makes down in Yunnan, in Xishuangbana, and he calls it sunshine flavor. And it's tea that is massaged and sun-dried, but it's not fully oxidized when he finishes it. And he says it's definitely not red tea, and it's definitely not white tea either. And when you taste it, it's kind of like red tea, and it's kind of like white tea, and it kind of tastes like Shangpua also, because it's made out of pu'er plants. So that's an unorthodox tea. And I think it's very important to not get too dogmatic about these categories that we've just discussed, that we've spent this entire time talking about, these different types, these different categories. It's very important, I think, to remember tea is a plant, and it will do what it do. And tea farmers and tea masters are people, and they will do what they do. And they will do things that they were taught to do, and they will do things that are part of their tradition, and they'll do things that they just make up. Li Shu-in's like, hey, I took some red tea and then I wo-duied it and I made it into Hei Cha. And it's, well, what is it? I mean, it's its own kind of thing. And that's the great thing about tea, is that it's a living culture and a living art. People are still experimenting with it. They're still pushing the boundaries of it. And these categories are not to limit or restrict us. They are simply to facilitate our understanding of this very magical and dynamic and diverse plant that we call tea. So that brings us to the end of our discussion about the different types of tea. Again, to recap, we've got green tea, we've got red tea, we've got oolong tea, we got a yellow tea, we've got white tea, we've got Hei Cha, we've got Pu'er, which is not one of these 6 categories. What is it? Sometimes it's green tea, sometimes it's Hei Cha. And then we've got purple tea, again, not a category, just a color of tea that you can have. And then we've got unorthodox teas. What is that? So that's just literally everything that doesn't fit into one of those categories that I just mentioned, or maybe does fit into a category. You could have a purple unorthodox tea, for example. I hope that you have enjoyed this final episode of season 2. I hope that you are coming away from this with more clarity and less confusion than when you entered it. And if you are leaving with more confusion, then I hope that that is helpful for you on your path to wherever it is that you are going. Thank you for joining us for these 2 seasons that we have done. We're very, very excited about getting to season 3, where we can do a lot of new stuff that we haven't done before. We've gotten to the end of season 2, where we've been going through these different categories, and now we've kind of wrapped them all up for you. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you for season 3.